this section, the section we are now reading, is section 1 called On Roots. Roots, there they are, on roots of social difference. And we read the first 3 articles for today, and for the next class, we'll read the second 3 articles. I think this is the only section that has 6 readings in it. The rest only have 5. So once we get through this, we'll be happier. Roots of social difference. I guess I would say that I struggle with the title of this section because it doesn't completely make sense to me. I think if you were talking about the roots of social difference, you should probably go back hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands of years. If we were talking about the roots of social difference, I want to retitle this section The Roots of Social Analysis, because we're reading things from about almost 200 years ago, 150 years ago, really before the university system and education for most people got started. And we'll talk about the context of these writings, but they're kind of what the scene was back in the day. They're not about the roots of they are about the roots of social difference, but they're more like giving us where this social analysis came from, or you might even say the roots of anthropology. Anthropology hasn't become a discipline yet. It hasn't become a subject. Nobody is studying it in school. No one has been to intro to anthropology class. No one has even knows what that is yet. That's not going to come up for a number of years. Now, Frederick Douglass uses the term ethnological, so there's ethnologically considered. So there are things going on that you might say are kind of related to anthropology, but that hasn't really been established yet. Now, I think as you can see, well, the roots of anthropology, some of these readings would probably be also considered to be the possible roots of a discipline like sociology or some other social science. A lot of the things, for example, Marx and Engels, or we'll later read Max Weber, are equally read maybe in sociology or other social science classes. But anthropology is really what makes it kind of distinct in some ways, is that these anthropologists start looking at people outside of the European and North American context to ask what might seem to be an otherizing question, but as the academic institutions were getting started, the question was, well, why are other people out there the way they are? What explains the difference in human looks, human behavior, human thought? Another root question here is that, are the inequalities that we see in society among and between human beings, were those always there? Are they always going to arise? What is the reason for the fact that some people seem to be on the top of the social order and some people are not on the top, or on the bottom of the social order, digging the ground there, trying to get the roots? And also, of course, this is a time of tremendous change. There are civil wars, movements to abolish enslavement of other human beings, but could society be changed? Could anything change, or was it sort of the way things were supposed to be, divinely ordained or naturally ordained? So in this section, again, we're reading things that come to us from quite a while ago. They don't really explain where social difference comes from, but they help to give us the sense of the context of the ideas that would later become part of anthropology. Now, the social context of the 19th century This book is called Anthropological Theory for the 21st Century, but these things are coming out in the 19th century. So, between 1800 and 1900. And the social context of that century is one of that had just been through a long period and was actually entering into another epoch of colonialism, and especially in the context of the Americas, of enslavement. And so this was a society that had been built on, for one thing, extraction and production of resources. For a while, looking for gold, but as some of you know, the silver mines of Latin America would revolutionize the world trade routes throughout the world. We could also talk about in our own hemisphere the incredible trade in the fur trade and the extraction of furs from the north. And so, there was this great movement of commodities around, and there were also the establishment of plantations, mainly staffed by enslaved Africans, mainly in most of the Americas, trying to produce sugar, and a crop that would eventually fuel the Industrial Revolution, but also things like tea and coffee, and the ability to put sugar into tea and coffee to give you the special drinks that we still love so much today. The Red Bull of its day, you might say. Tobacco. Forgot that one. But, a context in which the Americas and other parts of the world have been colonized. In this context, we also have the emergence of ideas about race. So before this time, people had, of course, looked at other human beings and wondered about physical and biological differences. But the idea that people came as different groups, which we might call races, and those races had shared characteristics or capabilities, that was a product of this period in time when people were brought together, dragged to different places and put together. And then, in fact, as many authors and observers are more arguing today, it is the racism of that time which invents race as a category in order to either justify or explain the social hierarchies and inequalities that existed. So a lot of people think that racism comes from race. That is to say, we think, oh, people are in different races and then they don't like each other. And that's actually not the way it happened. What happened is people needed something to explain and justify what was going on. And so they invented race because of racism. During this time, during the 19th century, as Darwin's ideas were coming out, people fastened on to the idea of evolution as a way to express this kind of racism, the idea that everyone was on a kind of ladder and that certain people were more related to the animals than they were to other human beings. Again, it was not necessarily Darwin's position. He tried to stay out of this for the most part, but there were a lot of people who piled on to this and tried to link it to their pre-existing ideas about how people should be sorted out in the world and if people should even be placed in the same category. During this time, we see the emergence of capitalism. I should say the emergence of industrial capitalism and what we know as the Industrial Revolution. So there had been capitalism already. It was developing, but the idea that it was mainly concentrated in factories and factory production. Now, I want to emphasize, for those of you who have recently or not so recently been with me in a Latin America class, that this capitalism that we know of, this wonderful industrial revolution, was built upon the silver mining and the sugar plantations and these resources that were already being exploited and had already, in some ways, very much changed the world. So this is the context in which people begin to write. Now, in these readings, we have three readings, three documents, which are all political documents and political treatises. That means there are statements that are trying to do something in the world. That is to say, sure, these authors are analyzing society, but their primary aim is not necessarily, they weren't writing to you as a college student. They were not trying to explain the world necessarily. They're trying to do something in the world. They're trying to effect change through their speaking, in some cases, and their writings. And so, again, these are not aimed at an academic audience. There was no such thing as an academic audience. No one was necessarily, might have been taking notes if they could, but they were primarily aimed at creating political change. And all three of these articles are anti-something. They're against something. They're trying to speak, write, agitate against something that is existing in the world. So they are not just out there for their own sake. They are out there because they want to do something. I will have you guess what each of these is anti as we go along. So let us begin with ask if there cannot be as good feelings and principles under a red skin. Wow, that's a little dated. It's an outdated term. It is an outdated term, as there can be under a white. Yeah, yeah, that's very vivid. It's very vivid. And so, you know, his own skin was apparently of quite mixed heritage. And so, you know, he's using the terms of his day and he's being very, very blunt here, right? And he even gets more blunt as you read down the page. It gets pretty intense. So one thing is to say, hey, we all can have good principles. But then he asks the question, under which skin has committed the most crimes or the most sins? Whose skin, under which skin has been the most crimes? Or as he puts it, which skin do you think would have the greatest national crimes? I will ask one question more. Can you charge the Indians with robbing a nation almost of their whole continent and murdering their women and children and then depriving the remainder of their lawful rights that nature and God require them to have? Question mark. Can you? He does have questions in there. As your video person put it, he uses what is called rhetorical questions, which is to say, of course not. No, you cannot charge the indigenous peoples with robbing a nation almost of their whole continent because they didn't do that. They were the ones who got robbed of this. So that's one little crime. But then I like this too. And he says, and to cap the climax, rob another nation for African slaves to till their grounds and welter out their days under the lash with hunger and fatigue under the scorching rays of a burning sun. Wow, man. So, you know, he's really hitting hard with the, you know, the saying that, you know, I should look at all the skins And I know that when I cast my eye upon that white skin, and if I saw those crimes written upon it, I should enter my protest against it immediately and cleave to that which is more honorable. So, according to him, it's probably true. And I can tell you that I am satisfied with the manner of my creation fully, whether others are or not. So he's saying, hey, I'm happy with myself. Hypocrisy, yeah, I mean, that's pretty historically established. So to add to the hypocrisy, what do you think, Abby? Is this relevant to today's world? Is anything like this still going on, or have we worked all this stuff out over the last? It's definitely still going on. I almost made everybody watch the video that you had from, voices from Native peoples and a few years ago about race and racism. I think probably in some ways, indigenous or Native peoples in the United States are perhaps the least reckoned with and understood by larger society and the kinds of things that they have to deal with. But yeah, this is definitely relevant. What is this anti? If you had to say it's primary anti against something. What is it? I think his primary goal, you can say he's anti a bunch of things, but his primary target here is the colonial mentality, right? He's going against this, the fact that the whole continent had been robbed and then, deprived of their rights. And that basically was saying that the United States was founded on this colonial mentality and it should be adjusted. Yeah, Tori. So we have our first article, which is Anti-Colonialism by William Apess. Our second article, all right, might be a speech, is by Frederick Douglass. The claims of the Negro ethnologically considered. Now, I have to say, I will first say that the main point, I believe, of this article, and he writes it in all caps, is that Black people are human. Now, I think we might get confused by the terminology a little bit. He uses the word man a lot, but I think he basically meant human in here. And that was the terminology of his time. Let's see. Tori, so he makes his first point is that, that in general, they haven't had the same opportunities. And so, he writes about, he's like, well, people will compare Clay, Webster, and Calhoun. These are sort of some of the famous oratorical politicians of the day, the people who were really good with words. And they would say, well, why don't we see Black people doing that? And he's like, well, wait a second. Most white people can't do that either. So don't make these unfair comparisons where you're taking like the top of the ladder of oratory and saying, oh, well, why aren't they doing the same thing? Why aren't they as smart as that? It's like, no, wait a second. Most white people aren't able to do that kind of oratorical skill either. So don't make this unfair comparison. And plus, if you deprive people of all opportunity to do that, of course, they're not going to be able to do that. Yeah, Tori. And I mean, yeah, and also there's a really interesting little comment at the end of this selection on page 17, where he says, an intelligent Black man is always supposed to have derived his intelligence from his connection with the white race. To be intelligent is to have one's Negro blood ignored. And so it's always like, oh, you must have been raised elsewhere. You had a different thing. And so, yeah, it's a totally different standard. And I mean, I think also, people talk about today, it's one of the things where, they ask us not to do this in class, but you'll turn to the one person that looks different in class and be like, what do such and such people think about this? As if you're supposed to be the representative for your whole race. Whereas I can say whatever I want, and you're not going to ascribe what I do to all white people, right? You're not going to say, oh, I hate those white people. They're always cussing too much. So, yes, that's one of his huge points. He also, again, he kind of comes out in some ways. If you read this in some ways, he actually is sounding a little bit like a creationist, or I mean, I don't think he's necessarily a creationist, but I think he is hating the way that people were trying to tie evolutionary understandings to ideas of race, and how they were trying to associate the African with the ape, right? They're trying to make those associations and trying to put people on a scale. And there were many people at the time who were so concerned about this use of evolution that they basically wanted to be more on the creationist side of things, not because they were anti-science, but the ways in which these ideas were being used were pretty awful. He makes another point, which is still to this day creates controversy and weird ideas. Still, people have all these bizarre ideas about it, about the place of Egypt. Tori, what does he say about Egypt? What's important for us to understand about Egypt?
Well, Egypt is in Africa's continent.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this is just this hugely important point that he makes. He's like, Egypt is in Africa, and you people who are all celebrating Egypt as the birthplace of civilization, and then if you took, the typical description of a typical Egyptian, that person would be classified as Black today. So come on, people. And so, well, Tori, you said this was still relevant today. True. Yeah, I mean, it's hard for me to even believe that these kinds of things are still being debated. But in fact, yeah, there's all these debates, but it is quite clear that the African and deep in Africa origins of Egyptian society and culture have become more clear, although lots of people want to deny them. All right, this should be easier. If this piece is anti-something, what is it anti? Anti-racism, right? So we have a Douglass writing to us in a way that, yeah, as you put it, is still relevant to today's world. Douglass is doing an amazing job getting recognized more. So as he should be, I say. I don't know. People made fun of Trump for that because it sounds like he thinks Frederick Douglass is still alive. Other people are like, no, of course he knows that. He's, got into a weird debate, but it is kind of true that his relevance to today's world, I believe, is quite great. All right. So our third piece is also a political document. It comes to us basically from the Communist Manifesto. And one of the things I want to emphasize about this document is a lot of people read it in classes now, and they read it as a source of social analysis. But really, it was written during a time to basically give shape and inspiration to an ongoing revolution that was happening. And so it's important when we're reading it to understand that this is more like looking at a poster on the wall to get people inspired to do something. And I mean, there's a lot of insight, there's a lot of analysis, but really you shouldn't confuse this with something that was written as as a book or as a textbook or something like that. I mean, they really wanted to inspire people to do something. I mean, they're supposed to be the bad guys. Remember, the proletariat is supposed to be the good guys, and the bourgeoisie are the bad guys, right? But it is odd when you read these passages, they do seem to have this sort of crazy respect for admiration of the bourgeoisie. In fact, that kicking out of them from the rural life, they actually say that's a good thing.
Yeah,
Right. Right. Rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. So, you know, and actually, Marx would write later about this. He did not like little farmers, what we would call peasants at all. And he said, you know, like he had this very famous line that, you know, that they were basically all the same. And and if you had a sack of potatoes, it was just as so many potatoes in a sack constitutes a sack of potatoes, that there was nothing about them as a class. They were just these potato heads, and they were just, you know, all doing the same thing. So he was not really into those people. And it created a lot of weird, later on, people who sort of subscribed to the sort of the Marxian view of revolution would make these weird alliances with like capitalist industrialists, because they'd be like, oh, we have to have that first before we can go communist. So it'd be like, it was strange. I mean, you know, listen to this part. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. All right, so I mean, again, it's a little bit over the top in its aberration, although they don't, of course, they'd become the bad guys later. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. I mean, you know, that's pretty amazing stuff. That's also, I forgot that Marx and Engels were the people who coined this phrase, all that is solid melts into air. I don't know if you've heard this, but this was them. I mean, there's so many things that they just basically coined. And again, this is talking about how the bourgeoisie would be revolutionizing the means of production. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. So for them, the bourgeoisie had created these conditions. Now, of course, then would emerge the proletariat. And in their view, the proletariat, the working class, you might say, was at the present time, they'd be competing among and against themselves, but more and more people were being swept into the proletariat. And so that we would only have these two classes, the bourgeoisie, the owners of the means of production, and the proletariat, those who had nothing to sell but their own labor power. And so for Marx and Engels, the proletariat would eventually realize that it had to hang together as a class. In fact, in this, as a social class, and in this, they have a bunch of stuff about how it would actually be the bourgeoisie competing with each other who swept the proletariat into the political sphere. But basically, when you came down to it, that inevitably the bourgeoisie were giving the proletariat the tools of their own destruction, and just like the bourgeoisie had destroyed the old order, the revolution was coming because the proletariat would rise up. Now, what do you think? Did this happen?
Capitalism.
So a lot of people get down on Marx and Engels, and they're like, you guys said the revolution was inevitable and it didn't really happen. I mean, you know, there were different things that happened, but like the idea that it was inevitably going to happen, they're like, well, you were wrong. They were wrong. Now, this is where I ask you to remember that they were not actually trying to analyze whether the revolution was inevitable or not. If you're in this situation, why do you want to say that the revolution is inevitable? I mean, again, you're trying to recruit people to the cause. It's like putting up a poster, right? Later on, Marx especially, once a lot of these revolutions kind of fell, he would sit back and be like more retrospective, you might say. But in the moment, you don't want to give up. You want to fight on. So they made this whole statement. All right, what is this anti-capitalism, right? Anti-capitalism. It's interesting, you know, for the videos you gave me of explaining the Communist Manifesto, I would then scroll into the comments, and it's like, you cannot have a rational debate today about any of these. These things are still too, like, if you look at the comments, people are like, yeah, but Russia, China, you know, I mean, it gets crazy. So anyway, I don't know if it's relevant today or not. I don't know if it can be separated from the things that went on under its name. So the big point of this matter is that we have this world of the 19th century, which was obviously formed about and from colonialism, from capitalism. I guess I should have listed it as colonialism, racism, and capitalism. But at the same time, we have these voices emerging. People like William Apess and others who were speaking against the colonialism that had happened and was ongoing. People like Frederick Douglass and others who were speaking out and trying to slow the development of racism and the linkage of evolution to racist ideas. And people like Marx and Engels and others, not just them, who were speaking against or trying to look past the capitalist order. What do you think?
Great stuff.
Great stuff. Is this where we are today?
It's where we would like to be.
It's where we would like to be. There are some people that believe, I'd just like to throw this out, that in some ways, we may be at more of a 19th century time again, and not to say that we're back, but it's like a lot of the things that were happening then seem to be coming about again today. And so there are some people who believe, for example, that, that during, say, the rise of industrial capitalism, say after the 1950s, there were all these different classes created and some, with the advent of Social Security and different social welfare forms, that people were less interested in revolution. There are some people today who believe that the conditions of revolution are now more in force or more potent than they were before, that the conditions of anti-colonialism or anti-racism are potentially more available to us now. I don't know. There might be something that is, you also might notice that that we should probably include on this list, but we haven't read about yet. What else might we want to say about this time period? Yeah. We have 3 things we can be anti. What else might we want to say here? What might be a big missing thing so far? Well, yeah, I mean, I guess there are various forms of anti-capitalism, and one of them didn't want so Marx and Engels are examples of people who wanted to basically take over the industry and even make it bigger than it was. There were also movements that wanted to sort of destroy the machines, go back to sort of more artisan production, the most famous among them being the Luddite movement, the Luddites who were known as machine breakers and wanted to, have you ever heard of the Luddites? If I call you a Luddite, will you feel, how will you feel? Confused, you'll feel confused. So yeah, I'll call you in a second. I just have to explain Luddites because, you know, when I was a kid and my parents couldn't use the latest technology, I would say, well, you're just a Luddite. And they would feel insulted. So the Luddites got perhaps unfairly associated with being the ones who are anti-machines and anti-technology, because they did have some episodes where they went in, I think they were led by a person named William Luddite, and I think that's the way you pronounce his name. And, you know, they broke machines. And so then that became a stereotype for anyone who is anti-technology. So now I guess they don't talk to you about the people who can't use their computer or their iPhone, so you don't get to call your parents Luddites, because they will probably be equally confused and everyone will just be confused. But there you go, Luddites. Yes, Tori, what are we missing?
I was thinking like sexism, women's suffrage, that sort of stuff.
We are missing that, yes. But fortunately, we're about to put that onto the list for in our next reading. So let's